From Worldwide Technology, this is the AI Proving Ground podcast. The enterprise AI landscape is loud. You already knew that. New chips, new factories, new policies, constant headlines. From the outside looking in, it may look like momentum, but from the inside, through the lens of IT leaders, it can often feel like confusion. Too many signals, and simply not enough clarity about what actually matters. For enterprise leaders, this creates a real tension. Move too fast and you lock yourself into expensive assumptions, but move too slow and you'll fall behind a curve that's already accelerating. So today's conversation sits right in that gap. To unpack it, we're joined by Lynn, a vice president at Intel who leads its AI Center of Excellence. Lynn sits at the intersection of hardware strategy, security, and enterprise deployment realities and offers a playbook for how to make sense of it all. And Mike Trojecki, who leads AI go-to-market strategy here at WWT. Mike has been working closely with organizations of all kinds trying to scale AI without losing control of it. We'll start with a simple but difficult question. Amid a marketplace full of announcements and ambition, what's the real signal enterprise leaders should anchor to, and what can they afford to ignore? So let's jump in. Lynn and Mike, welcome to the AI Proving Ground podcast. I think this might be the most geographically diverse set of guests we've had. Lynn, I know you're out there in Oregon near Intel HQ, and Mike, I believe you're at our WWT New York City office. So, and I'm right smack dab in the middle at St. Louis in WWT GHQ. So to the two of you, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, this is great. And we've got every time zone covered. And I'm staring at lovely New York. It is a little freezing cold here right now, but for us South Carolinians, it's definitely cold.
I love it. Well, before we get into the meat of the conversation, Lynn, I do want to start with you. A little bit of a clear the table type of question. 2025 was a consequential year for Intel. Lots of investment, partnerships, manufacturing milestones, and so on. Certainly competitive pressures. For enterprise leaders out there listening today, what should they be thinking in terms of what's real signal versus what is noise they can kind of put to the side?
So 2025 has been super consequential. As you know, we started with different leadership. We started with different strategies. And what you see reflecting in the end of 2025 is this recognition that AI is moving super fast. And we want to participate in all aspects of the AI hardware continuum. And so, at the beginning of the year, you might be thinking, oh, Intel's going to exit networking. We're not exiting networking. We have a huge emphasis over the last 9 months on security. We want to be the secure foundation that goes across all of these capabilities. Whether or not we're actually running the models on our hardware, you still have to be able to secure and govern things, especially as we're moving from what was much more the chat interface, much more creative world, to something that's agentic. And you're bringing in diverse models, you're bringing in diverse data sources. And so the real signal is that as you look at AI being diverse and broad and having efficiency challenges, having governance challenges, looking for security and making sure we cover those vulnerabilities, and making sure that we're actually getting all of the data in and out the way it needs to be in efficient and low power way. That's really the signal to pay attention to for Intel. It's much more about recognizing not where we've been, but where the industry itself has to go and what has Intel's role been in that is unique. And that includes things like manufacturing. It includes things like supply chain and making sure that there's security regardless of what economy you happen to be participating in or where you're deploying your AI solutions.
Yeah,
Mike, your read on all that.
Yeah. So it's interesting, right? Because you look at 2025 and, Lynn had mentioned leadership changes at Intel and some of the things that are happening, but you also look at how the government is getting involved in investing in companies like Intel. Mm-hmm. So it becomes more than just kind of financial aid. It's really, you look at where this is all going, and it is about establishing the U.S. as the world's leading chip maker. Right. So we look at that and we see these things and what Lynn is talking about. And I think it all points to that. So from a governance standpoint, a sovereignty standpoint, we're looking at trying to, reimagine the U.S. as that leading manufacturer. Right. We have to shift the balance of power back. Right. So it's more about national industrial policy, I would say, at securing our technology foundation.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Yeah, Mike, I guess one question that I have for you too is like some of the latest news that's come out. It seems like we're going back a little bit and forth on AI policy a little bit. Curious if you see that as something that is going to have a long-term effect, or is it more just it's pragmatic, it's what has to happen because, it right now is a global economy.
Yeah. Well, you have to separate that into two areas, right? You look at just AI governance from a global standpoint, but even here in the U.S., some things that are going on. You look at how do we regulate AI, or do we regulate AI? Do we do it at a federal level or a state level? I mean, the beauty of being the United States of America is that the states get to make their own decisions in a lot of cases. And when it comes to AI, we're starting to see that AI can it be managed down to a state level, or does it need to be managed at a federal level, or does it need to be managed at a global level? I mean, we have a ton of people on staff that deal with a lot of those things from a government standpoint. But that's the thing that is interesting, going back to what you just mentioned, Lynn.
Yeah, I mean, from our standpoint, we're participating broadly in the broad economy. That's why, we've got 18A and our 14 nanometer process. And actually, sorry, that's why we've got 18A in our advanced process nodes. And the reason that we're building them out is making sure that we are the foundation that the world can manufacture on. And then, from the standpoint of national global interests, there is a key element of being a domestic manufacturer that is strategic, and that is a multifaceted dynamic that we have to manage through, is the both and of being in all those markets. So super exciting. I think the main signal is AI's moving fast, Intel's moving fast. We are being flexible about what we're offering to different customers. That includes being the most widely deployed head node or host node with GPU systems. Super exciting about that because, again, it's that data foundation and that CPU processing foundation. If you look at things like agentic systems, you're going to bring in much more diversity of models. And so we want to be the technology provider. And it's not just at the chip level. We want to be providing solutions that look at the rack level. We want to be providing solutions even in packaging. So really the main principle is we're open for business, and we are going to be aggressively participating at every level of the AI hardware build out.
Things are unfolding kind of so rapidly all the time, in real time, really. And that unfolding, that pace of change can certainly lead to confusion in the market. And I think that's, one of my next questions was certainly, I think a lot of people still misunderstand AI infrastructure as just GPU. Lynn, I know you and others at Intel kind of have an interesting perspective here. What other misunderstandings might the market have from your perspective as it relates to AI and how to harness it and how to move forward with it?
I think one of the main things that we've seen is that there's this default of AI equals specific hardware infrastructure, or AI equals a specific model. And the reality is we've had a number of partners, and WWT and Intel have a couple key partners right now that are finding that it is completely overblown. It's driving a Ferrari to get groceries or take your kids to school if you're just doing document summarization, or if you're doing things like chatbots. And so the question is really matching the need for the capability to what you have available before you start over engineering what's going into hardware. And, if we'd had a little bit more of that, we probably wouldn't be looking at some of the power and cooling challenges, some of the water challenges that we're hearing about as there's these build outs. But there's still this opportunity to start pragmatic and to start very with what you have deployed, and be very simple and judicious, and then add as you go. I've heard about 20,000 person call centers that are basically running on CPU servers with really light accelerators, such as what we talked about at the OCP event, which was the codename Crescent Island. So there's a lot of flexibility in this. And I think people are going to have to go back to finding those efficiencies, because you can't just build out and then find that you've hit your cap on power, water, cooling, available data center space, et cetera. Mike, I'd be curious in your perspective here.
Yeah, and I think the true value here is, for the enterprise anyway, is combining the strengths of all those different types of processors. So whether it's CPU, GPU, specialized accelerators, and you look at this world as an ecosystem world. So when Intel is looking at this and looking at where they fit into the market, there are so many places that people are looking at this, like you said, specific workloads when it comes to some of the agentic pieces, and especially as we take these agents and we move towards very specialized type agents. Maybe it's a predictive model in manufacturing, maybe it's document summarization, like you said. Those are the things where we don't have to fit everything into one architecture. It's going to be a multi architecture down to the chip level.
Right, right. And that's the reason for the flexibility in our strategy. I mean, essentially in September, we partnered with Supermicro to talk about how our TDX Connect confidential AI capability works next to NVIDIA product and NVIDIA GPUs in those accelerated systems. So it's not an either or, it's really match the needs to what the capability requirements are, and don't over engineer it, I think is really the main point on that. And then, one of the other things that I would also say is, as we're looking at predictive models for manufacturing and things that do require more security, one of the things that we also want to be clear about is that we are best in class on product security assurance. We proactively reported 94% and then remediated them, and some of our competitors were just over 50%. And so all of those things are really what enterprises have to think about when they're deploying, as opposed to thinking about, how do I create a new flyer for my restaurant? And so those differences are really, really important to think about as we move forward.
Well, one of the things, and Lynn, I don't know if you would agree with this comment or not, but when it comes to this stuff and where CPUs play, they play great at general purpose, kind of low latency type tasks, where it becomes more about the bottleneck being data movement, not raw computation power.
Right. I completely agree with that. In fact, a conversation I had earlier this morning was talking through the fact that you can put agentic and AI systems in place, but if you can't get past the data security, the data silos and things like that, and even the ability to move the data efficiently, then you're starving your AI system. So you really have to start with the data repositories, those data systems, and making sure they're efficient, but that the AI system's access to them is efficient.
Yeah, everything you both are articulating, it's a very practical message. Lynn, I love what you said about, taking your kids to school in a Ferrari. My kids would absolutely be thrilled to go to school in a Ferrari. But if you're taking that practical approach, if you're taking that flexible approach, Lynn, I mean, what type of implications does that have for how you build your your infrastructure overall? What types of considerations should we be thinking about to ensure that flexibility in 2026 and not get boxed into a corner where you are stuck with that Ferrari on the way to school?
I think one of the main things that I've seen, and I've seen it even with some of the largest vendors on the planet, they go and effectively default to a specific solution approach and then discover, oh, I can't power them on. In fact, one of the leading CEOs for one of the leading lights has said, we have GPUs and we're going to stick them in inventory because we can't power them. And so I think that that's a really, really critical thing, is not to just order and then figure it out. It's really understanding, how do we get the maximum out of the infrastructure that we do have deployed, and then judiciously add to that as we know more about the system. A lot of the do anything with AI push that we've been having required you to just order things that were the default solution because you didn't know what you're going to do. Now I think that enterprises are much more clear on what the solution space is. And so it's getting more and more refined, but also when you can buy GPUs and you can't power them, instead of having that situation, maybe the thing is to actually add an ounce of planning and prevention instead of trying to remediate it later. So I think it looks like really knowing what is going to be a mass deployment, what is going to be a broad deployment, and then how can we most efficiently leverage the infrastructure we have, and then really plan for your power capacity. What can you afford to include, and how much headroom does that give you? Mike, I don't know if you've seen something similar, because I know that WWT does a lot of really intensive hardware implementations from very simple to very extreme.
Yeah. And just before you even go down there, I take my Aston Martin to go get groceries, and I leave the Ferrari and the Lamborghini in the garage. So just so we're clear on that.
Crystal clear.
Yeah. So one of the things, Lynn, that you just brought up was, I'm kind of not skirting your question here, but I just want to go back, is the energy piece of this. And I look at this and say, that is one thing that I wake up and that I worry about. We have, this enormous, demand for GPUs, but potentially nowhere to put them. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we over rotate on, does it have to be a GPU? And with a CPU, and when we're looking at that, just look at computer vision or, natural language processing. Those things can be run on CPUs, and they're, the energy piece, the cost piece, the lower latency piece. I just want to drive that point home. So I think that's an incredible thing for you to bring up is, the things that frankly I worry about is, okay, where are we going to put this stuff? And I can't go into a data center and just magically move things around to add, more power or, have a megawatt type rack. Those things take time to actually get implemented.
Yeah, and you can't mix liquid cooling and air cooled, and I mean, there's so many different things to think about there. One of my favorite examples of natural language processing in manufacturing, Intel managed to deploy sentiment analysis across our tools flows in manufacturing using natural language processing. It was all CPU based, and all it did was help us understand what was going to happen in terms of failure mode analysis. Can we get ahead of that and do predictive maintenance instead of reactive maintenance? So there's some very, very practical use cases that really do make business more efficient, make enterprises run well, that aren't just big LLM systems. And that NLP use case that I just gave, that could be part of an overall agentic system around failure mode analysis, around predictive maintenance, that is one element of it. So it's not just retire what you had deployed, it's really how can you refactor that into a full workflow, I believe.
Yeah, I love what you're getting in there. I mean, the next wave of AI, certainly not always going to be large language models. You're talking about agentic systems. You're talking about small language models. You're talking about use case specific models. Maybe at the risk of making a little bit of a dummy in the room question here, but Lynn, as we move into more specified use cases, is it always CPU? Is it always GPU? Or do they bounce back and forth from time to time? How does that work?
I think there's no question, if it's training, you're going to do a GPU. I think for some of these other small language models, vertical specific models, predictive analytics, computer vision, it really comes down to the use case. Like we have an example where you can do 40 cameras with a CPU. You can't do that with certain GPUs. That's more of a computer vision edge use case. I think that it is ambiguous, which can be frustrating because people would like the simple rule of thumb. But I think that it's also important to really, really understand the use case before you start engineering the hardware.
Yeah, there's no hard and fast rule with any of this yet, right? So when you look at it, and Brian, you mentioned agentic. As we get down into the agentic piece, you may have agents running on GPUs, you may have agents running on CPUs, right? It's going to depend on the task that is required. And going back to Lynn's comment about taking the Ferrari to get groceries, right? If you try and deploy everything on one single architecture, you're gonna misuse capital, right? You're gonna spend too much on energy, and you are going to misuse resources within your organization. So I look at this, and kind of this agentic world is going to shake things up a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean, this seems like as good of a time as any, Lynn, to start bringing in the concept of center of excellence. And I know that
Yeah.
you do lead Intel's AI Center of Excellence. And when you're talking about, it depends on the task required. It depends on where the workloads are going. I mean, is this where the real crucial role of an AI Center of Excellence lives, so that it can
Mm.
start to understand kind of an organization as a whole and parse it out? Or let's dive into that a little bit.
It started that way, which
Okay.
is really trying to parse it. Now, when you look at centers of excellence for AI, a lot of companies have them, Google has them, others. And I believe that every year, maybe even every 6 months, their roles have shifted. Like, for example, at the beginning of this year, it was really much more about how do you figure out what kind of asset runs what kind of workload for what kind of use case, and giving as clear a rule of thumb as you possibly could. Going out of 2025, I think the Center of Excellence is really asking questions around agentic governance, around agentic sign off. Like, when you have agents running your infrastructure, but humans are still supposed to be the ones signing off on the operations, you can have all the arguments you want about humans make mistakes, AI makes mistakes, what's the big deal? But our legal frameworks, our regulatory frameworks aren't caught up to that. And so I think that there's an element of practices, of governance, of application in an AI Center of Excellence. And then there's always a technology element of where's the technology going? What are the optimizations for today? So it's a both and.
Yeah, that's an important part, right? Because when you look at the governance piece and you're talking about these agents and you're talking about this human in the loop, I mean, you're really going to need to assign a digital credential to these agents, right? You've got to
Mhm.
be able to provide traceability. You've got to be able to implement zero trust for those agents. So for me, when we look at the impact that these agents are going to have in the world, I mean, you've got to run that through your organization, not just talking, you mentioned security early, not just talking from an architectural standpoint, but from a security and governance standpoint as well. And that's one of the things that a center of excellence should be responsible
Right.
for, is
Yeah,
taking all those different pieces.
yeah, it's interesting because I have a certified IAPP AI governance professional, and a lot of the curriculum had started out as much more around model provenance, data provenance, digital rights, digital services acts, and things like that. Really hasn't started touching ground yet, I believe, on signing off on agents and the provenance of what the agent behavior was, and having that human in the loop and figuring that out yet. So I really see that as the next wave.
One of the things that we've been doing there is being able to test these agents. And Brian, I know this, we talk about the AI Proving Ground and the AI Proving Ground podcast, but you look at being able to test those agents in a controlled environment and being able to bring those into something like the AIPG is critically important, right? And when you look at that from, again, going back to the center of excellence, those are the things you need to keep in mind is what does this look like? How am I building this out pre-production? Making sure I'm testing it in my environment, in a simulated environment before I actually roll it out to scale.
Yeah, absolutely. Lynn, you're mentioning Provenance here. And I know one of the things that you had mentioned to me before is certainly how that sovereignty conversation is becoming
Right.
more important for our shared clients as we move into
Mhm.
2026. Does that change anything that we've been talking about to date, or does it just reinforce what we've been talking about so far?
I think it reinforces it because sovereignty is very difficult when you're talking about a fully global cloud hosted business.
Hmm.
And so I think that really what you're going to end up seeing is it's not just provenance, it's also where's your hardware, who owns your hardware, who's managing your hardware, and basically who has rights over the control systems for it. And we are just, I think, on the front edge of those conversations about sovereignty. And sitting in the US, we might have a different perspective on what that looks like than if you're sitting in Europe or you're sitting in Asia. And so I don't know that we're even scratching the surface on what you're seeing internationally, but at least for us, yeah, the provenance is going to be, I think, at a heightened area of concern. Governance is going to come into play. It used to be run fast, break things, and deploy. We're going to have to go back and really start looking at how do we govern? What does human in the loop mean? What are they accountable for? And what's the traceability of the event logs and some of the sightings as these systems are getting more and more rolled out and more automated for things that are mission critical.
Yeah, Mike, you're dealing with clients on the ground. Well, in this case, New York, maybe high up in a skyscraper. But is that how organizations are actually acting right now, or are they going to have to make big changes?
It's not make big changes. They just need to get more organized around their centers of excellence, define what that means, define what governance means. I mean, we talked about this. What does it look like from a sovereign standpoint? These agents and AI are going to make mistakes, just like a human would. So, how do we have intervention protocols in place to establish when that happens? Right? Where's that kind of big red button that they say to? All right, we're gonna turn this off before it gets out of hand here. So, I look at that and say, our customers are doing an okay job of identifying, hey, we'd love AI to do X, but where they're not getting to the crux of the issue is, I want it to do X. What happens when it doesn't do X, right? What happens when it makes a mistake? And, there's data that runs outside of that organization, whether it's an enterprise, whether it's a country, a nation state. I mean, there are going to be those situations. So that center of excellence should be able to have that kind of that intervention protocol, if you will.
No, absolutely. Lynn, we're coming up on the bottom of the episode here. So, we'll kind of wrap up with some of these last couple questions. We're recording this episode actually at the end of 2025, but we'll release this very early in 2026. So it's a good time to kind of say, what did you learn this year that you're really going to start to apply in 2026 that's going to be a priority this year?
I think that for me, what I learned this year is that the hypothesis, AI is not one size fits all, was absolutely true. However, the diversity and the breadth and the sprawl of how AI is deployed surprised me. And so that was one of my big learnings, is just how quickly we pivoted from agents are the thing to agents are doers. And we didn't necessarily keep up on some of the governance and security and the other considerations. So for me, that was the learning of, it felt like a huge snap and a huge explosion in diversity. And so going into 2026, I expect that we're going to be in a digestion period from all of that explosion and that sprawl and that diversity. And then we're going to come up with a next level of deployment questions and the new wave of what's next.
Yeah, Mike, similar learning / action, or do you have a little bit of a different take?
No, it's similar. One thing I will add to that is from an adoption standpoint, right? People adopting, organizations, governments adopting AI. It's this whole world right now. People are looking at this and saying, "Hey, are we in an AI bubble?" What I've learned is there is no bubble. We are underinvested in AI from an infrastructure standpoint. The demand for AI is outpacing the supply for AI right now. So it's different than when we look back to the .com bubble. That was a lot of investment without customer demand. We're seeing the reverse right now. And looking at that was the biggest thing I learned was, man, we're really underinvested in AI. And if it's true, and Lynn talks about the sprawl, for that sprawl to continue, we need to invest more in the infrastructure, and that's both on-prem, in the cloud, and in hybrid situations. So that was the biggest thing I took away from 2025.
Yeah, well, then finish that kind of thought. What does that mean? Not just for you and for WWT or Intel, but what does that mean for enterprise IT leaders, AI practitioners? What does that signal to them that they're going to have to do in 2026?
Yeah, you're going to have to look at moving beyond production into scale. You've got to get these infrastructures scaled out if you're going to be competitive, right? As you look at this agentic world, that scale doesn't necessarily have to come from a large data center or a large model. That scale is probably going to come from smaller models and the use of agents or specialists that are good at one job, rather than being one big agent brain or one big AI brain that's sitting out there to do everything. So that's my advice is look at that, make sure your infrastructure is ready to go. And that's not just from a technology standpoint, but it's power, it's cooling, it's space, all of the above.
Yeah. Well, certainly an interesting future that we have in front of us. Lots of opportunity, but also lots of complexity and lots of questions still to be answered. I'd love to have the two of you on at this time next year just to see exactly kind of, what transpired over the next 12 months or so. But Lynn, Mike, thank you so much for taking time with us here on the podcast, and we appreciate your time and thanks for the partnership.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks to Mike and Lynn for joining the show. As we wrap up, one lesson stands out. The constraint isn't imagination, it's discipline. What this conversation makes clear is that AI didn't stall in 2025, it fragmented. More models, more agents, more architectures, and more ambition. And that sprawl is real value creation, but only if it's matched with intentional infrastructure choices, governance, and restraint. This episode of the AI Proving Ground podcast was produced by Naz Baker and Kara Kuhn. Our audio and video engineer is John Knobloch. My name is Brian Felt. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.